At 10:47 p.m., a barefoot woman walked into a cemetery in Durban, carrying everything she had left in a small black bag. And the strangest part was that she had no idea the homeless man, waiting beneath the abandoned chapel, had been declared dead 3 years earlier. Rain poured down over the cemetery gates, turning the narrow paths between the graves into black rivers, while distant headlights moved along the road outside and disappeared behind the trees. Amara kept walking, her soaked dress clinging to her body, one hand pressed tightly against the bag, because inside it was a cracked photograph of her mother, 2 changes of clothes, and the last pieces of a life that had been taken from her in less than an hour. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not go back. Every few steps she looked toward the rusted gate, half expecting someone to appear, perhaps a security guard, perhaps one of the household employees, or even Evelyn Ashbourne herself, coming to say that the accusation had been a mistake. Nobody came. That was when Amara finally stopped beside a broken tombstone and allowed herself to cry. She covered her mouth with both hands, trying to keep the sobs inside, because the last thing she'd been given that night was the humiliation of crying in front of people who had already decided she was worthless. Then, through the rain, she saw a small orange flame. It was burning beside a grave beneath the partially collapsed roof of an old chapel. A man was kneeling there, carefully wiping mud from the name carved into the stone. He looked poor enough to disappear into the darkness. His jacket was faded, his trousers were torn at one knee, and one boot had a long split running along the side. Beside him sat a dented metal cup, a thin blanket, and half a loaf of bread wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Amara stopped. The man looked up. He did not stare at her body. He did not ask what she had done. He did not ask why a young woman was wandering through a cemetery alone at night. He simply looked at her bare feet, her soaked clothes, and the small bag she was clutching against her chest. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" he asked. Amara froze. She had not told him anything. Her voice broke. The man slowly stood. "You can stay here tonight." She looked toward the ruined chapel. "Here, at least you'll be out of the rain." A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the cemetery. The man glanced at the sky and added, "Well, mostly out of the rain." Despite everything, Amara almost smiled. Almost. She stepped beneath the roof. The man moved the blanket toward her. "Take it. You'll be cold." He shrugged. "I've been cold before." Then he broke the loaf of bread in half and gave her the larger piece. Amara stared at it. "You need it. So do you." She accepted it. The two of them sat in silence while rain hammered against the roof and water dripped through 3 holes above them. Finally, the man said, "Daniel." She looked at him. "Amara." He nodded. That should have been the end of their conversation. Instead, it was the beginning of a story that would eventually expose a multi-million rand fraud, destroy a powerful family, and force Amara to question everything she believed about the man sitting beside her. But 3 hours earlier, Amara still believed she had a home. At 8:07 p.m., she had been standing inside the Ashbourne mansion with a silver tray in her hands, exactly where she had stood almost every evening for 6 years. She knew that house better than most of the people who owned it. She knew Evelyn Ashbourne drank black tea at exactly 6:30 every morning. Knew Marcus hated cold coffee, knew which windows rattled when the wind came from the harbor, and knew where the expensive valuables were kept. She also knew she had never touched Evelyn's diamond necklace. That truth meant nothing when Evelyn walked into the hallway holding an empty velvet jewelry box. "My necklace is gone." Amara looked up. "I didn't take it, ma'am." Evelyn's face hardened. The necklace was worth 4 million rand. Security searched Amara's room. They searched her locker, the laundry room, the kitchen cupboard, even the small suitcase beneath her bed. Nothing. Then they checked the security cameras. At 4:12 p.m., Marcus Ashbourne entered Evelyn's private dressing room. He stayed inside for 7 minutes. Amara never entered. The footage was perfectly clear. Even the security manager admitted it. For one brief moment, Amara thought the truth was finally going to save her. Evelyn stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she said, "That camera has been unreliable." The security manager hesitated. "It appears to be functioning normally, ma'am." Evelyn turned toward him. "I didn't ask what it appears to be doing." The room fell silent. Marcus stood near the staircase, staring at his phone as though none of this concerned him. Amara looked at him. Sir, you were in the room. Marcus slowly raised his head. Are you accusing me? No, I only. Then don't use my name. Evelyn stepped between them. Enough. You have worked in this house for 6 years. You know where my valuables are kept. Amara's voice shook. I have never stolen from you. Evelyn stared at her. People like you always say that. That sentence hurt more than the accusation itself. Because Amara suddenly understood that Evelyn was no longer looking for the necklace. She was looking for someone to blame. At 8:31, Evelyn gathered every employee in the front hall. The accusation was repeated in front of everyone. Amara begged them to check the cameras again. Nobody moved. She looked at the security manager, then at the cook, then at the gardener. She waited for just one person to say, "She's telling the truth." Nobody did. Evelyn slapped her. The sound echoed through the marble hallway, and for several seconds nobody dared to breathe. A drop of water fell from Amara's sleeve onto the floor. She touched her cheek and looked around the room. She was not waiting for someone to take revenge for her. She was waiting for one person to remember that she was human. Nobody did. At 8:47, Evelyn ordered her out. Amara's suitcase was thrown onto the driveway. Her clothes spilled into the rain, and the photograph of her mother fell from the bag into a puddle. Amara dropped to her knees and picked it up. The frame had cracked. Her mother's face was still visible through the water. Evelyn stood beneath the warm light of the mansion entrance. "Leave it," she said. Amara looked up. "She was my mother," Evelyn shrugged. And those two words broke the last piece of hope inside her. Amara carefully placed the photograph inside her bag, stood up, and looked at the mansion one final time. 6 years of work. 6 years of loyalty. 6 years of believing that if she worked hard enough, she would eventually be treated with dignity. She had been wrong. The gate opened. She walked out. The gate closed behind her. She called the only friend she thought might help her. No answer. She called again. Nothing. She had no family waiting for her, no savings, no room to return to, and no job waiting for her the next morning. She walked until her feet hurt, until the rain soaked through everything she owned, until the lights of Durban became distant and blurred. Then she saw the cemetery. She entered because there was nowhere else to go. Now beneath the broken chapel, Daniel noticed the photograph in her hands. "Your mother?" he asked. Amara nodded. Daniel looked toward the grave beside them. "Keep her close." Amara looked at him. "Why do you take care of these graves?" Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone should remember them." She studied his face. There was something in his answer she could not explain. A sadness, something familiar. Something that made the homeless man sitting beside her seem less like a stranger and more like someone who had also lost something he could never replace. Daniel pushed the last piece of bread toward her. "Eat." She looked down at it. "You don't have anything left." Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither do you." Amara took the bread. Outside, thunder rolled across Durban. Inside the ruined chapel, two people who believed their lives had reached their lowest point sat together beside a forgotten grave. Amara thought she had entered that cemetery because she had lost everything. She was wrong. She had entered because that was where she was about to meet the man who would change the rest of her life. And if she had walked past that chapel that night, if she had decided to keep walking through the rain, she would never have discovered why the homeless man beside her had been hiding from the world for 3 years. By sunrise, the cemetery looked different. The rain had stopped, the clouds over Durban were turning pale gray, and the wet stones reflected the first light like pieces of broken glass. But Amara still woke beneath the abandoned chapel with the strange feeling that she had fallen asleep inside someone else's nightmare. For several seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then she felt the cold stone beneath her shoulder, saw the torn blanket covering her legs, and remembered Evelyn's voice saying, "That isn't my problem." She sat up quickly. Daniel was gone. The half loaf of bread was gone too, and for one frightened moment she wondered if she had imagined the entire night. Then she saw him near the far wall of the cemetery, kneeling beside another grave with a small brush in his hand. He was cleaning dirt from the name carved into the stone. "You always do that?" Amara asked when she approached. Daniel did not look up. "Do what?" "Clean graves that don't belong to you." He brushed away another layer of mud. "Someone should." "Why you?" He finally looked at her. "Because nobody else is." There was something about the answer that stayed with her. Daniel did not say it like a speech. He said it like a fact. Later that morning, Amara learned that he had been living around the cemetery for almost 3 years. He knew which security guard allowed him to stay near the chapel, which shopkeepers sometimes gave him leftover bread, which public absorbs still worked when the others were dry, and which graves had relatives who came every Sunday. He knew the cemetery better than anyone she had ever known. Yet, there was something strangely careful about him. He folded his blanket before leaving. He kept his few belongings organized inside an old canvas bag. He never begged aggressively. He never shouted. He never touched anything that wasn't his. When a woman dropped a purse near the cemetery gate, Daniel ran after her for almost 200 meters just to return it. Amara watched him from the roadside. "You could have kept it," she said when he returned. "There was money inside." Daniel shrugged. "It wasn't mine. Most people wouldn't have returned it. Most people aren't me." He said it so quietly that she almost missed the humor in it. Over the next few days, their lives began to overlap. Amara found temporary work helping a fruit seller near Warwick Junction, earning barely enough to buy food, while Daniel took whatever work he could find carrying boxes, repairing fences, unloading trucks, and cleaning shop fronts. He never complained about the work, but Amara noticed that he sometimes knew things he shouldn't. He could look at a truck and tell whether its tires were properly inflated. He could glance at a handwritten invoice and immediately notice a calculation error. Once, while they were eating beside the chapel, Amara mentioned that the fruit seller was losing money because his supplier had changed the delivery route. Daniel studied the numbers for less than a minute and explained exactly where the extra cost was coming from. Amara stared at him. "How do you know that?" Daniel looked down at his food. "I've worked around businesses." "What kind?" "Big ones." "How big?" He smiled. "Big enough to make mistakes expensive." That was all he said. The mystery should have irritated her. Instead, it made her curious. Daniel was also strangely generous. When Amara earned her first 180 rand, she bought 2 loaves of bread and returned to the cemetery. Daniel refused to let her give him the whole loaf. He divided it again. "You don't have to keep sharing everything with me." "Neither do you. I might become poor because of you." "You already are." She laughed. He laughed too. It was becoming a habit. And somewhere between the broken chapel, the market, the cemetery paths, and the small meals they divided equally, something changed. Amara began looking for Daniel when she came back from work. Daniel began waiting near the cemetery gate, around the time she usually returned. Neither said anything about it. They did not need to. One evening, Amara came back with a cut across her palm from a broken crate. Daniel immediately took her hand and examined the wound. "You need to clean this. It's nothing." That's what people say before an infection becomes something. He washed the wound with clean water, wrapped it carefully with a strip of cloth, and held her hand for 1 second longer than necessary. Neither moved. The cemetery suddenly seemed very quiet. A bird shifted somewhere above them. A leaf fell from a tree and landed beside Daniel's boot. Amara looked at him. He released her hand.
"There. Thank you. You're welcome."
She went inside the chapel that night, with her heart beating faster than it should have. But the strange things were not over. 3 mornings later, a black Mercedes stopped outside the cemetery. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out, looked directly at Daniel, and froze. Daniel was carrying a bucket of water. The man's face changed. Recognition, fear, something else. He walked closer. "Sir," Daniel immediately raised one hand. "You've mistaken me for someone else." The man stared at him. "I know who you are." Daniel's voice became colder. "Then you know you should leave." The man hesitated before placing a thick white envelope on the cemetery wall. "They've been looking for you." Daniel did not touch it. "Go." The man left. Amara watched the Mercedes disappear. Who was he? Daniel picked up the envelope. "Nobody important. He came in a Mercedes. That doesn't make him important." "He called you, sir." Daniel looked at her. "Some people call everyone, sir." She knew he was lying. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Amara noticed the envelope still sitting beside his bag. She did not open it. She simply stared at it until Daniel woke. "You can ask," he said. She looked at him. "Who are you?" Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Someone who doesn't want to be found." The answer frightened her more than a confession would have. The following afternoon, the truth came closer than either of them expected. Amara was buying bread near the market when a television inside a repair shop suddenly switched to a news report. A photograph appeared on the screen. A younger man in a dark suit stood beside a massive mining operation, surrounded by executives and government officials. The caption beneath his face read, "Daniel Mensah, founder and CEO of Mensah Mineral Holdings, presumed dead." Amara stopped breathing. The face on the screen was older than the man she knew, cleaner, better dressed, but the eyes were unmistakable. The same eyes that had watched her walk into the cemetery. The same scar above the left eyebrow. The same calm expression. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel was standing in the doorway of the shop. He looked at the television, then at Amara. Neither spoke. The news presenter continued explaining that Daniel Mensah had disappeared 3 years earlier after a suspicious vehicle accident, and that his company had since fallen under the control of his brother. Amara slowly turned toward him. "That's you." Daniel said nothing. "You're Daniel Mensah." He lowered his eyes. "That man is dead, but you're standing here." Daniel looked toward the cemetery in the distance. Not everyone who is declared dead gets to stop living. And that was the moment Amara realized the homeless man beside the grave was carrying a secret far heavier than poverty. She just didn't know yet that the secret would eventually connect her accusation, Evelyn Ashbourne, and the man who had supposedly died 3 years ago. Daniel did not answer her immediately. The televisions continued talking behind them, the presenter calmly describing the disappearance of a man who was standing less than 3 meters away, while outside a taxi rolled past with its tires hissing against the wet Durban pavement. Amara watched Daniel's face and saw something she had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but the exhaustion of a person who had spent too long carrying a secret alone. "Come with me," he said. They walked back toward the cemetery without speaking, past the market stalls and the crowded road, until the noise of Durban faded behind the rusted gates. Daniel stopped beside the abandoned chapel and sat on the same stone where he had first offered her half a loaf of bread. "3 years ago," he began, "I owned Mensah Mineral Holdings." He spoke without pride. There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to make himself sound important. He simply told her what had happened. The company had started with one small mining operation and grown into a major supplier of manganese and other minerals across southern Africa, employing hundreds of people and carrying contracts worth hundreds of millions of rand. Daniel had built it with his own hands, beginning with a borrowed office, 2 second-hand trucks, and a loan of 417,000 rand that a bank manager had warned him would be almost impossible to repay. By the time he was 41, the company was valued at more than 8 billion rand. But Daniel's greatest mistake had not been trusting the wrong bank or signing the wrong contract. It had been trusting his older brother Marcus. Marcus had handled the company's finances for 11 years, and Daniel believed blood meant loyalty. It did not. Marcus had created shell companies, redirected payments and borrowed against company assets, without Daniel's knowledge, moving money through accounts in Mauritius and Dubai, while making the books appear clean. When auditors finally noticed inconsistencies, Marcus had already prepared his defense. Documents appeared with Daniel's signature. Emails appeared showing approvals Daniel claimed never to have given. Money had vanished, and every trail seemed to point toward the CEO. Then, on a Thursday evening at 9:18 p.m., Daniel's vehicle left a mountain road outside Pietermaritzburg. The car crashed through a barrier and caught fire. The driver died. Daniel survived because he had been thrown from the vehicle before the explosion, but he woke in a rural clinic with broken ribs, a fractured shoulder, and no idea how long he had been unconscious. The first thing he learned was that the police believed he was dead. The second was worse. Marcus had already taken control of the company. Daniel could have returned immediately, but his lawyer warned him that doing so without evidence would make him the easiest target in the country. So Daniel disappeared. He allowed the world to believe that the crash had killed him while he quietly gathered evidence against his brother. "You lived in a cemetery for 3 years?" Amara asked. "Not the whole time." He looked toward the graves. "But I kept coming back." "Why?" Daniel's eyes settled on one particular grave near the chapel. "Because my mother is buried here." Amara followed his gaze. The silence between them became heavy. She died before the accident, he said. She was the only person who knew what Marcus was capable of, and I didn't listen to her. Amara reached for his hand but stopped before touching it. Daniel noticed. He turned his palm upward. She placed her hand in his. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He looked down at their hands. "Because the first time I met you, you were sitting in the rain with nothing." He paused. "And you still shared your bread with me the next morning." Amara smiled faintly. "You shared yours first." "Exactly." For a moment, the billionaire and the woman accused of stealing a necklace were simply two people sitting beside a grave. Daniel told her that he had watched people change whenever they discovered his wealth. Business partners became friends, strangers became relatives. People who had ignored him for years suddenly remembered his birthday. "I wanted one person to meet me before knowing what I owned," he said. "And I didn't want to test you." He looked embarrassed by the word. "I just wanted something in my life that wasn't a transaction." Amara understood more than she wanted to admit. She had spent 6 years inside a mansion where everyone had decided what she was worth by the uniform she wore. Daniel had spent years surrounded by people who decided what he was worth by the size of his company. They had been standing on opposite sides of the same loneliness. After that night, something between them changed. Daniel stopped pretending that Amara's questions were inconvenient, and Amara stopped pretending she was not falling in love with him. Their relationship grew in ordinary moments rather than grand gestures. He waited near the market when her shift ended at 6:15. She saved the last piece of fried bread for him when she knew he had skipped lunch. He repaired the broken strap of her bag with fishing line, and she laughed so hard that he accused her of insulting his craftsmanship. One evening, while they sat beneath the chapel roof, Amara asked what he would buy if he suddenly became rich again. Daniel thought for several seconds. "A house," she laughed. "You already had houses. Not the kind I mean." He looked at her. "One with a kitchen where two people can argue about dinner." Her smile disappeared. "Two people? Maybe." He looked away. "If she likes me." Amara felt warmth rise into her face. "Maybe she does. Maybe, don't push your luck." They laughed quietly while rain tapped against the roof. It was the happiest Daniel had felt in years. He could have bought her a diamond the next morning. He didn't. Instead, on a Sunday afternoon, he brought her a small silver ring from a market stall near the beachfront. It cost 1,870 rand. "It's not much," he said. Amara stared at it. Neither was the bread. Daniel looked confused. "What? The night we met, you had half a loaf and still gave me half." She slipped the ring onto her finger. "This is worth more than anything I've ever owned." Daniel's eyes became wet, and for once he did not hide it. They married 11 weeks after meeting. There was no ballroom, no expensive flowers, no reporters waiting outside. They signed the papers at a small registry office in Durban at 11:32 in the morning, with two strangers serving as witnesses, but because neither of them knew anyone, they trusted enough to invite. Amara wore a simple cream dress. Daniel wore his old jacket. Afterward, they bought 2 meat pies and sat on a bench overlooking the harbor. Amara leaned against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. Daniel looked at the cheap ring on her finger. For the first time in 3 years, but Daniel still had not told her everything. He had not told her that the investigation into Marcus was almost complete. He had not told her that one of the financial trails led to a wealthy woman in Durban whose name had recently appeared in his files. And he certainly had not told her that the woman was Evelyn Ashbourne. He kept the documents locked away because he wanted to protect Amara from reopening the wound she had barely begun to survive. Then, 43 days after their wedding, Amara found a metal case hidden behind a loose panel beneath the old chapel floor. Inside was a photograph of Daniel standing beside a private jet, a company share certificate, several legal documents, and a newspaper clipping with a headline that made her hands go cold. Daniel Mensah had not merely been the CEO. He had been declared dead. She was still staring at the photograph when Daniel entered the chapel. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "You said you wanted one person to know you before knowing what you owned." Her voice was quiet. "I know now." Daniel said nothing. Amara held up the photograph. "So tell me, Daniel, how much of our life has been real?" The question hung between them like a blade, and this time, Daniel knew there was nowhere left to hide. Amara did not move. She was still holding the photograph when Daniel closed the chapel door behind him, and for several seconds the only sound between them was rain tapping against the broken windows. "How much of our life has been real?" she asked again. Daniel looked at the metal case on the floor, then at her face. He could have lied. 3 years of surviving had taught him how easy lying could become when the truth put something precious at risk. But Amara had already been lied to once by people who believed they had the right to decide what she deserved, and Daniel could not become another one of them. "All of it," he said. "Every part of it." He sat beside her and explained everything he had left out, including the evidence he had gathered against Marcus and the financial records that had brought him back to Durban. Then he placed one folder on the floor between them. On the first page was a name Amara recognized immediately: Evelyn Ashbourne. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. "Why is she here?" she whispered. Daniel did not answer immediately. He opened another document. It showed a payment of 680,417 rand from a company controlled by Marcus to a private consulting firm connected to Evelyn. Another payment had followed 3 weeks later, then another. The dates went back nearly 18 months. Amara stared at the numbers. "This started before I was accused." "Yes, then the necklace was a distraction." Daniel's voice was calm, but his jaw tightened. "We believe Evelyn used the necklace to create a theft story that would justify removing you from the house and destroying your credibility." Amara felt the old humiliation return like a physical weight. "Why me?" "Because nobody would question a poor employee." That sentence hurt because it sounded exactly like Evelyn. Daniel explained that Marcus had been moving money through several companies while preparing to regain complete control of Mensa Mineral Holdings. Evelyn had provided access to wealthy clients, private accounts, and information about potential investors. The necklace had been used as collateral in a private transaction that began to collapse when investigators started to ask questions. Someone needed to take the blame. Amara had been convenient. But Daniel needed proof, not suspicion. So he made 3 calls. The first was to an independent forensic accountant in Johannesburg. The second was to the attorney who had preserved the original corporate records before Marcus took control. The third was to a former security supervisor from the Ashbourne estate named Peter Mbeki, a man who had disappeared from the family's payroll 11 months earlier. Peter agreed to meet at 6:20 the next morning beside a coffee shop near the harbor. He arrived carrying an old phone and a brown envelope. "I kept these because I knew one day somebody would ask," he said. Inside were copies of security logs, staff schedules, and handwritten instructions bearing Evelyn's signature. One page showed that Marcus had entered Evelyn's dressing room at 4:12 p.m. on the day the necklace disappeared. Another showed that Peter had been ordered to disable one section of the camera system for exactly 9 minutes. "I refused," Peter said. "That's why they fired me." Daniel looked at him. "Why didn't you speak earlier?" Peter laughed bitterly. Who would have listened to a security guard against Evelyn Ashbourne? The answer sat heavily on the table. Daniel asked whether Peter knew anyone else who had been pressured. He did. The first was Grace Ndlovu, the estate manager, who had worked for Evelyn for 14 years. Grace agreed to testify. She brought records showing that Evelyn had repeatedly instructed her to change staff schedules whenever Marcus needed private access to the house. The second was Michael Ross, an accountant, who had questioned unexplained transfers totaling 7.3 million rand. He had been dismissed after asking why payments were being routed through companies with no physical offices. The third was Peter. 3 people. 3 separate stories, 1 pattern. Daniel's attorney filed the evidence with investigators at 9:14 a.m. 2 days later, Evelyn received a request for an interview. She refused to cooperate. She said she was being harassed by a disgruntled former employee and ageless young woman who had stolen from her. Marcus made the same mistake. He publicly called Daniel a fraud and insisted that his brother had died 3 years earlier. "If this man is truly Daniel Mensah," Marcus said during a television interview, "he should prove it." The next morning, a sealed legal document was delivered to Marcus's office. It contained Daniel's verified identity, medical records from the rural clinic where he had survived the crash, fingerprints, and the original corporate authorization documents bearing Daniel's signature. But Daniel did not stop there. He wanted the necklace. The investigators traced the jewelry to a private vault in Johannesburg. It was still there, unused, untouched. The serial number matched Evelyn's original purchase records. More importantly, forensic examination found no evidence that Amara had ever handled it. Evelyn's story collapsed, but she still refused to admit guilt. When investigators confronted her with the security footage, she said the footage had been manipulated. When shown the payment records, she called them fabricated. When Peter testified that she had ordered him to alter the cameras, she accused him of revenge. She never once said, "I was wrong." She said, "I was protecting my property." That sentence would become the most important thing she said, because the investigation revealed that Evelyn had not simply made one terrible decision. She had built a system around the belief that her wealth gave her the right to decide who was trustworthy. Marcus had done the same thing with power. Together, they had assumed that Amara's poverty made her disposable, and Daniel's disappearance made him powerless. They were wrong about both. 3 weeks later, the board of Mensa Mineral Holdings voted unanimously to remove Marcus from every executive position. His company accounts were frozen pending investigation. Several contracts were suspended, and 2 banks demanded immediate clarification of transactions connected to the shell companies. Evelyn's assets were placed under review. The mansion where Amara had once been thrown into the rain became the subject of an official search, and still Evelyn insisted that she had done nothing wrong. When a reporter asked her whether she regretted accusing Amara, she looked directly into the camera and said, "I would make the same decision again if I had the same information." Amara watched the interview from a small office beside Daniel. She expected to feel anger. Instead, she felt tired. "She still doesn't understand," Amara said. Daniel looked at her. "Maybe she never will." Amara shook her head. "Then I don't want her apology." Daniel waited. "I just want the record to say I didn't steal anything." He reached across the table and took her hand. "It will." That afternoon, the investigators formally cleared Amara of the theft allegation. Her name was removed from the police report. The necklace was returned to its owner. Evelyn's story was finished. But Amara's was not. Because when Daniel asked what she wanted now that the truth had finally come out, she did not ask for money, a house, or revenge. She looked through the window toward the city and said, "I want to go back to the cemetery." Daniel frowned. "Why?" She smiled faintly. "Because that's where you found me when I had nothing." And Daniel understood that the most important part of their story had never been the money, the company, or the necklace. It had been the night 2 people who believed they had lost everything sat beneath a broken roof and discovered that neither of them had to be alone anymore. But before they could return to that cemetery, Daniel had one final piece of evidence to uncover, and it was hidden inside the one place neither of them had expected. The house where Amara had once been called a thief. The investigators returned to the Ashbourne mansion at 7:18 the following morning, and, this time, Evelyn could not make them leave. The same marble hallway where Amara had once stood with a silver tray in her hands was now filled with people carrying evidence boxes, sealed envelopes, and computers, while the polished floor reflected the flashing lights outside the gates that had once made Amara feel as though she was standing on the wrong side of the world. Evelyn watched from the staircase, with her arms folded tightly across her chest, refusing to sit down, refusing to answer questions set, and refusing to admit that anything had gone wrong. "You are making a mistake," she told the lead investigator. "I know exactly what happened in my house." The investigator looked at her calmly. "That's why we're here." They searched the dressing room first. Inside a locked cabinet behind several rows of perfume bottles, they found the original jewelry records, a second phone, and documents connecting Evelyn to the private company that had received payments from Marcus. Then they opened the safe. The necklace was gone, but the transaction records showed where it had been taken. Evelyn had used the necklace as collateral in a private agreement worth 680,417 rand, hoping to recover money that Marcus had already moved through one of his shell companies. The theft accusation against Amara had been created after the transaction began to collapse. It had never been about protecting the necklace. It had been about protecting Evelyn's reputation. By noon, the story was spreading through Durban. By evening, the same people who had once watched Amara walk through the Ashbourne gates with her suitcase were watching news reports about Evelyn's investigation. The woman who had told Amara that poor people should know their place was now being questioned about missing funds, false statements, and financial arrangements she had insisted did not exist. Marcus disappeared for 2 days. Then his lawyer announced that he would cooperate with investigators. He did not. He tried to leave the country. He was stopped at the airport at 5:42 p. with 3 passports, 214,000 rand in cash, and a folder containing documents from 4 companies that did not legally employ a single person. His downfall was not caused by Daniel. Daniel had simply turned on the light. Marcus had built the room himself. The board of Mensa Mineral Holdings formally removed him 6 days later, and the company began recovering the money that had been hidden through the shell companies. Several contracts were reviewed. 2 executives resigned. The banks demanded repayment. The lawyers began counting losses. Evelyn's mansion was eventually placed under a court order while investigators determined which assets were connected to the transactions. She still refused to apologize. When a reporter asked whether she regretted what happened to Amara, Evelyn said, "I acted on the information available to me." Amara watched the interview in silence. She expected anger. Instead, she felt something she had never expected to feel toward Evelyn. Pity, not forgiveness, not sympathy for what Evelyn had done. Pity for a woman who could lose everything and still refuse to examine the person she had become. Daniel sat beside Amara. "You don't have to forgive her," he said. Amara nodded. "I know, you don't owe her that." "I know." She looked at the screen again. "But I don't want her inside my head anymore." Daniel reached for the remote and turned off the television. "Then don't let her stay there." 3 weeks later, Amara's name was formally cleared. The police report stated that there was insufficient evidence connecting her to the theft, and that the evidence instead indicated deliberate fabrication of the accusation. Her former co-workers began calling. The cook apologized. The young housekeeper cried on the phone and said she had wanted to speak that night, but had been too afraid. The gardener came to the market where Amara worked and stood there for nearly 10 minutes before finally saying, "I should have defended you." Amara accepted the apology. She did not punish them for being afraid. She knew fear could make decent people silent, but she also silence could leave another person alone in a storm. Daniel's company returned to his control, but he did not move back into the corporate apartment waiting for him. He did not buy a new mansion. He did not replace the old jacket he still wore. Instead, he drove Amara back to the cemetery on a gray Sunday afternoon. The gate was still rusted. The grass was still uneven. The abandoned chapel still had 3 holes in the roof. Amara stepped inside and looked at the stone wall where she had slept during the worst night of her life. "It looks smaller," she said. Daniel smiled. "Everything looks smaller after you've survived it." They walked deeper into the cemetery until Daniel stopped beside a grave covered with small white flowers. The name carved into the stone was Miriam Mensah. Amara looked at him. "Your mother." Daniel nodded. "She was here when I had everything." He knelt and touched the stone. "And she was here when I thought I had nothing." Amara stood beside him. Daniel told her that after the accident, when everyone believed he was dead, he had come to this cemetery because his mother was the only person he trusted completely. He had sat beside her grave for hours, sometimes speaking aloud, sometimes saying nothing. He had watched businessmen search for him, lawyers argue over his company, relatives speculate about his fortune, and strangers speak about his death as if they had known him. "I could have gone anywhere," he said, "but I kept coming here." Amara sat beside him. Because of her? Because she knew me before the company. He looked at her, before the money, before the title, before everyone wanted something. Amara took his hand. "And now?" Daniel looked at her. "Now I have you." She smiled through tears. "You had me when you had nothing." Daniel squeezed her hand. "That's why I know." They stayed there until the light began to fade. Then Amara noticed the old chapel behind them. "We should fix it." Daniel looked at the broken roof. "Why?" "Because someone else might need it." That sentence changed everything. Over the next 6 months, Daniel used part of his fortune to restore the chapel and build a small shelter beside the cemetery for women who had nowhere safe to sleep. There was a kitchen, 12 beds, showers, lockers, and a small office where Amara began helping women find work and legal assistance. Daniel refused to put his name on the building. Amara refused to put hers there either. They called it the open door. The first woman who stayed there had been thrown out of her home by a relative. The second had lost her job without receiving the wages she was owed. The third had simply run out of places to go. Amara never asked them what they had done wrong before offering them a bed. She knew better now. Every Sunday evening, she and Daniel returned to Miriam's grave. Sometimes they brought flowers. Sometimes they brought bread. Sometimes they sat in silence. One evening, months after everything had changed, Amara looked at Daniel and said, "Do you remember what you asked me that first night?" He smiled. "If you were lost. You asked if I had nowhere to go. You did." She looked toward the chapel. "I was wrong." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "I thought I had nowhere to go." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I just hadn't found the right place yet." Daniel looked toward the old cemetery gate, the same gate she had entered barefoot on the worst night of her life. "Neither had I." Rain began falling softly over Durban. The cemetery's stones darkened. The flowers beside Miriam's grave bent beneath the drops. Amara reached for Daniel's hand, and this time neither of them had to say anything. They had both learned the same lesson from opposite sides of the world. A person's value is not measured by the clothes they wear, the house they sleep in, the job printed on their name badge, or the number written in their bank account. Evelyn had looked at Amara and seen a servant. Marcus had looked at Daniel and seen a company he could steal. But on one terrible night, when neither of them had anything left to prove, Amara had looked at Daniel and simply seen a man offering her half a loaf of bread. Daniel had looked at Amara and simply seen a woman who needed somewhere safe to sit. That was enough. The people who had tried to take their dignity had eventually lost their money, their power, and their reputations. But Amara and Daniel had gained something neither of them could have purchased. They had found a home in another human being. And sometimes, when the rain falls hardest over Durban, Amara still walks through the cemetery beside Daniel, past the graves and the repaired chapel, remembering the woman she was that night. She remembers the wet dress, the broken photograph, the locked gate, and the terrible certainty that her life was over. Then she looks at the warm light coming from the open door and remembers what she knows now. Some doors close because people want you to believe you are worthless. Others close because they are leading you somewhere else. And sometimes the place you are forced to go is the place where you finally discover that you were never worthless at all. Amara once walked into a cemetery because she had nowhere else to go. Years later, she walked out of it with Daniel beside her, knowing that she had not been abandoned that night. She had been led to the first place where someone saw her not as a servant, not as a thief, and not as a poor woman, but simply as a human being. And that was worth more than any necklace Evelyn Ashbourne had ever owned.